With a loud report, the bolt slammed home, and the wicket gate banged shut behind me. I turned to face the tall walls and massive wooden gates that had held me prisoner for the previous 5 years. I said to myself, "Okay, man, just what are you going to do now?" I had someone's revenge on my mind right now. Though I was unsure of whom specifically, I would still need to exercise caution. I had enough, 7 years at Her Majesty's pleasure. I started walking down the short approach road to the prison slowly. I was being observed by a small group of people who were on the opposite side of the main road, waiting at the bus stop. They'd all probably seen me getting out, and they were presumably on their way to work. They must have to watch most mornings as prisoners are released, I suppose. I thought I saw a small group of reporters off to my right, who were starting to move in my general direction as I reached the end of the approach road. Oh no, the scum suckers were waiting to ambush me outside the joint after bothering me for years while I was inside. Out of nowhere, a car pulled up next to me. The door opened, revealing a well-known face emerging from within. "Your car, Mr. Carpenter," the man said as he gave me the keys. The man pointed his eyes toward the advancing reporters and said, "I'd say you could do with getting out of here a bit snapper-like. There's £500 cash in the glove box with a mobile phone and your luggage in the boot. Ronnie's waiting at the cottage. He asked if you'd please give him a ring if you decide to spend the night elsewhere." With a "Cheers, Ralph," I slid into the driver's seat. Not that there was time to mess with the damn thing. I departed as soon as I could under the law. I didn't want to bother the local police, but I did want to get away from those damned reporters. After getting out onto the motorway, I varied my speed to see if I was being followed before swinging out onto the main road and heading west away from the city. It was not long before I saw the car, a small, white vehicle with only one person inside. I actually said to myself, "Damned reporters," as I entered a motorway service area. I was going to scare the shit out of them with this one and tell them where to get off. I parked my car in an empty section of the lot and waited for the following vehicle to enter. It stopped pretty close to me, which surprised me. I exited and made my way toward it. I was even more shocked to see that a woman was behind the wheel as I drew closer. The woman sat there with an oddly neutral expression on her face throughout the little tirade that I delivered in about the most angrily sounding tone of voice I could muster. "Now look here, lady, I've got nothing to say to any bleeding reporters. You bleeding scum suckers tried to hang, draw, and quarter me. What gives any of you the idea that I'd want to speak to you now?" Then I turned and headed for the cafeteria, stomped, rather, away from her car. You see, I was a convicted murderer, so I was trying to play the part to scare her away, but it didn't seem like she was easily scared off. She slid into the seat across from me as I had just settled in with my coffee. "Mr. Carpenter, first I need to tell you that I'm not a reporter. Secondly, I think I can help you, and I really need you to help me. Will you please listen to what I have to say?" I carefully examined her. Yes, the look was intended to worry her a little bit, but the response I received made it clear that she was neither intimidated nor afraid of me. She had almost everything in the perfect proportions and locations, if you know what I mean, so I'd estimate her age to be around 35. Come on, I'd spent 7 years in the bleeding slammer. That kind of thing was going to catch my attention. I gave up on staring her out and said, "Okay, shoot. Let's have your spiel and then you can leave me alone, all right?" She nodded and took out a small folder, similar to what some of the coppers keep their ID in, from her handbag. Is she really not a bleeding copper? I pondered in my mind. She flicked her wrist deftly to open the small folder. The card featured an extremely unflattering photograph of Helen Caffrey alongside the words, "Helen Caffrey, British and International Mutual Insurance. You're wasting your time with me, girl. I've got nothing left to insure. What my ex didn't take in the divorce, she's had in child support and alimony. No, Mr. Carpenter, I don't sell insurance. Technically, I'm a loss adjuster. So? I haven't lost anything that I was insured against. You know, there aren't many people who think to insure themselves against false accusations of murder. You did plead guilty, Mr. Carpenter. I didn't have much choice on that one, lady. Those bleeding coppers had me stitched up like a turkey at Christmas. They planted so much evidence that if my mother had been on the bloody jury, she'd have convicted me. No, with the way those assholes had me stitched up, if I'd kept pleading innocent, the scum suckers would have me locked up forever. It's all to do with repenting your sins or some such crap like that. So are you now saying that you were framed and didn't kill Mary Simmons? I'm not saying anything. I'm on parole, you know. Yeah, maybe you do know that. Have you been sent to try and stitch me up as well? Mr. Carpenter, look, my name's Helen. May I call you John? Call me what you like, it doesn't change anything. John, have you got time to listen to a story? Go on then, young lady, I'm listening for the moment. John, my father was a loss adjuster, and he taught me the business. Do you know what loss adjusters actually do? Yeah, they come to look at the damage when you make a claim and then try to wriggle the insurance company out of paying out on it. Well, I suppose it could look that way from some people's perspective, but really, my job is to make sure that the claim is genuine and people aren't trying to rip off the company. That's what I said, didn't I? The company figures every claim is somebody on the fiddle, and it's your job to prove them right. When Helen finally said, I somehow don't think we're going to find any common ground on that. You've got that one right, girl, I answered. Helen scowled at me. I felt pretty good about myself, I discovered her weakness. She objected to being referred to as a girl. John, a lot of women find that offensive. There are experts among us. Our actual task is to look into claims that appear inflated or suspicious. What then do you wish to do with me? I haven't stated anything. The company my father and I work for carried a life insurance policy on Mary Simmons. Hey, what's up? And you believe that just because I was found guilty of her murder, you can have the money returned to you? That one is out of your luck, sweetie. I was pretty well cleaned out by my ex. John, just take a moment to be serious and pay attention to what I have to say. Are you going to? It's crucial. All right, go ahead, girl. No more interruptions from me. 6 months prior to his wife's murder, William Simmons procured a substantial insurance policy for her, even though he had already taken out a comparable policy for himself. My father remained dubious about it. When you were found guilty of Mary's murder, the company was forced to compensate for some reason, but my father wouldn't let it go unchecked. My father was also upset that William Simmons had cancelled his own policy not long after his wife was killed. Well, when he got his hands on Mary Simmons' money, she was a wealthy woman. Bill Simmons probably wasn't concerned about insurance at all. You were familiar with the Simmons? Not really, just via commercial dealings. A portion of Mary's company's hiring was managed by us. Not much, as she was a good manager and there wasn't much employee turnover. Look, John, my dad always felt that something was off with the way that Mary Simmons and you ended up. He was unconvinced even after you retracted your plea to guilty. How about you? In that hotel room, did you think I had stabbed Mary Simmons? Helen said, well, to be honest with you, yes, at the time I did, and abruptly stopped speaking. However, what? John, my father would not let it go. Have you ever watched any TV episodes of Columbo? Well, sure, I've spent a lot of the last few years watching Columbo's in the Nick. These days, all you could watch on TV was repeats, and there wasn't much else to do. They dislike it when we deadly killers get bored. Helen ignored or wasn't the slightest bit fazed by my hint that she was sitting there with a convicted murderer. Well, my dad was kind of like Columbo once he got the bit between his teeth. He was not going to let it rest. My father would make an effort to be present wherever Bill Simmons went, simply letting Simmons know that he wasn't persuaded. You're speaking of your father in the past tense, I said. Yes, a while back, my father perished in a hit-and-run collision involving a stolen vehicle, which joyriders were put down by the police. Later that night, they discovered the car was completely burned out. That's also what I initially assumed it to be. That is, until I started organizing my father's apartment. I found a large file on the murders of Mary Simmons, William Simmons, and you on his desk. I was unaware that my father was watching Simmons closely. So, why ought he to have remained involved in the case? Even so, the claim had already been resolved when you admitted. That file made it clear that my father had been closely monitoring Simmons's activities in the years after his wife's passing and your conviction. You know, Mary's assets were all progressively sold off by Bill Simmons, and the money just vanished. My dad, however, was unable to discover what he did with it. He didn't know where Simmons moved it, but he believed it was outside of the nation. Dad kept a detailed log of Simmons's whereabouts and the people he'd met, but there were many instances in which Dad was unable to track Simmons down. Remember that my dad seemed to be doing all of this in his free time. I became curious after seeing Simmons with my father, so I decided to just take a quick look. The only issue was that I couldn't locate Simmons. He vanished from the face of the planet 2 years ago. I've been attempting to locate him ever since. That is really suspicious, whether I like it or not, and I really want to know what the hell has been going on. However, I had exhausted all possibilities, so I decided it would be best to go back and begin with Mary's passing and your conviction. You refused to talk to me while you were incarcerated, and you refused to talk to my father when he tried to visit you. Shall you now tell me about it? Then I turned to face Helen and sat back in my chair, surveying the nearly empty cafeteria. Well, young lady, I could be willing to talk about it, but this is neither the place nor the time, I said. I recently got out of jail, and to be completely honest, I still don't know what to think. In a few days, I might decide to get together with you once more. Then perhaps we can have a meaningful conversation. I am now 2 years into my wait. I'll wait a few days if that's what you want. Please provide me with your phone number so I can reach you. I lied, saying, sorry, girl, I haven't got a telephone yet, even though I knew the car's glove box contained a cell phone. You give me a number where I can get hold of you, and I'll call you. After giving me a card with her phone numbers on it and thanking me for the conversation, she got up and left. I watched her go, appreciating the way she packed her clothes. After allowing Helen enough time to leave the parking lot, I went back outside to check on Helen's car, and since she wasn't there, I went back to the motorway to see if anyone else was following me. It took me almost 60 miles to be certain that nobody was following me, so I got off the motorway and started to return via the old roads, arriving at the cottage around 3 o'clock in the evening. Ronnie McIntosh, my sometimes legal representative and best friend, had bought the cottage on my behalf, or rather, a Bahamian company's, some months before my release. How on earth did you get here? As soon as I entered the room, Ronnie made a demand. I was tailgated out of prison. I want no one in the world to know where I live, not even Bugs. I have to tell the parole people to keep their nose clean, which is bad enough, but they shouldn't bother you in the first place. Who trailed you? A bird, possibly connected to the insurance company that was duped into paying out a large amount for Mary Simmons's passing. Caffrey, Helen. Are you acquainted with her? Caffrey? Ah, here we are, Ronnie said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a file with my name clearly printed on the front. Caffrey, yeah, that name rings a bell. However, it's a George Caffrey, not a Helen. He asked me several times to schedule an interview with you when they first sent you down. In your typical language, you instructed me to tell him to go for a hike. And then, a few months ago, his daughter appeared. I also told her to forget about it. Reading aloud from the paper, Ronnie said, well, I think she reckons that the grieving widower might have murdered Mary and her father. No, that was thoroughly investigated at the time. All Bill Simmons needed was a solid alibi. The police made a very good job of framing me after giving him a close inspection before they even considered you. Look, John, you always claiming that you were set up by the police. For a moment, imagine that it wasn't them but rather someone else, possibly even Bill Simmons. No, he was not capable of doing it. He would have required access to both my office and my home. Even if he did break into the house, there was no way in hell that he could have planted all of that evidence. No, during their purported searches, those bleeding coppers planted everything. John, I understand you've always believed the police set you up, but I fail to see how they could have obtained a pleasant, simple conviction. Heiress Ronnie is killed in an opulent hotel. Her lover, a local businessman, is charged 3 days later. Extremely effective police. I'm willing to wager that multiple promotions resulted from that small hiccup. Well, let's set that aside for the moment. How about my children? When will I be able to meet them? After a few moments, Ronnie finally responded, "Look, Johnny, we've got a bit of a problem there," wearing a worried expression. "I'm not interested in learning about your issues. I would like to know when I can expect to see my kids again. In a way, I can accept that after all of that, Angela decided to divorce me. That was tossed around in court, but she had the option of periodically bringing the kids to see me. The point is, John, we don't know where to find Angela or the children at the moment." "What?" "Last year, she sold the house. You know, she's been renting an apartment for a while now." "No, I was unaware of that. Why on earth would she want to get rid of the house? Everything was paid for in full." "Jeanette, I have no idea. You are aware that she didn't communicate well with me." "John, that's not the worst of it, though. Last week, I dispatched Ralph to set up a visitation for you and the kids, but she had already left. There was no forwarding address and the apartment was empty. It is absurd why she would do that. It's conjecture, John, but you are aware that she has a court order prohibiting you from speaking with her directly or traveling within a mile of her home. Maybe she's afraid of you. You know, the last time you talked to her, you were a little chatty. Did I not have the right to be, after all? She recently informed me that I would be getting a divorce due to my alleged liaison with Mary Simmons. I had anticipated that my spouse would support and believe me. Please, Ronnie, leave me alone to think about this and get the hell out of here. When I'm more composed, which should be in a day or two, I'll give you a call and we can discuss. Find out where my bloody kids are in the interim." Before he left, Ronnie ordered me takeout, told me all about the cottage, when the housekeeper came, etc., and when the food finally arrived, I sat down to enjoy my first night of freedom with it and a bottle of scotch. The next morning, I woke up with the biggest hangover ever, realizing that somewhere in the cottage, there had been a woman singing, and that no amount of hiding under the duvet could stop the sound. Then, all of a sudden, she burst into my bedroom carrying a breakfast tray, which she placed on the table beside the bed, and then she went over and drew back the curtains. All of this I inferred from the sounds and the sudden brightness in the room that was visible through the duvet that I was still trying to figure out. "Salutations, Mr. Carpenter. The best thing in the world for a head like you must have this morning," the woman said, sloppily removing the cover from over my head. "Now, you get this down you. What on earth are you?" Prior to being sent to prison, I had never worn anything to bed, but on my first night of freedom, I had started wearing something again. I managed to ask at the same time as I tried to make sure the lower half of my body was still covered. "Your housekeeper, Jenny, here." She practically poured the dubious-looking concoction in the glass she was holding down my throat as she said, "Now get this down you." Oh my God, what on earth was that? After nearly choking on the disgusting concoction, I remarked, "It tasted awful." "It's a family secret, but you'll be feeling better as soon as it rains," she reassured me. "Or dead," I shot back. "It shouldn't hurt you, and my father drank more than one bottle of scotch every night, so it didn't kill him. Now take a seat. It's important that you understand this as well. You must maintain your strength," she uttered in an odd tone of voice. She proceeded to pick up the tray and set it on my lap, saying, "Oh my, have we got a little problem there?" Jenny smiled at me and said, "Eat your breakfast, then give me a call and we'll see what we can do about that before you have your bath." Look at me now. Jenny was a true woman in every way, and I had not had a female companion for at least 7 years. I took some time to get to know her. Perhaps a tad too elderly and chubby for my taste, but beggars cannot be picky. Additionally, it seemed like she was eager to get started based on the way she was speaking. Jenny left the room while I was eating, but she came back when I called for her. I have to admit, I was shocked to see that Jenny was completely nude when she came in. "What do you think? Do I make it through the inspection?" She performed a small pirouette in front of me before asking. Bloody hell, Jenny, that's one hell of a body you've got there, I responded. Not bad at 45, is it? It's a shame my elderly father didn't value what he had. He gets none of it now that I caught the scum sucker shaming the little tart down the pub. You can have whatever you want. Okay, rationally speaking. I refuse to stay the night. These days, I keep that jerk of a husband under strict control. Jenny, I'm beginning to suspect that you're a very wicked housekeeper. Well, it's payback time. I have no idea how many little tarts he has been shagging over the years. And I jumped at this job when Mr. McIntosh mentioned you'd been away from women for a while, she answered, maintaining that sly smile. Oh, so Ronnie did, in fact, set you up for this? I inquired. Oh, my God, no. Mr. McIntosh was a perfect gentleman. I just thought a man who's been away from women for as long as you have would like a bit of female company on the side. Jenny, Ronnie McIntosh is a bleeding solicitor. The last thing I describe any member of that profession as is a gentleman. All right, if you say so. But he doesn't know about any of the extras I'm prepared to throw in on this job, and I'd prefer it if you didn't make it common knowledge as well. You have my word as a gentleman and an ex-con. But aren't you in the least bit worried that you are offering to climb into bed with a man who's been convicted of murdering his last lover? Pigs might fly first. John, you were never Mary Simmons' lover, and I very much doubt you murdered her. I'd stake my life on that. Hey, maybe I am staking my life on it. How can you be so sure? Well, now let's see why I believe that. Mary Simmons just happens to have been a member of the tennis club where I happened to have a job as a cleaner at the time. Now, almost every guy in the club had eyes for Mary, as I remember. No disrespect to you, John, but there were some pretty fit guys there. You're not bad looking, but you never were Robert Redford. No offense taken, Jenny. But how do you know what I looked like back then? Newspapers and the telly, silly. Your face was plastered all over them. Anyway, I happen to know that Mary Simmons had a penchant for the young men, the younger the better, if you understand me. And normally 2 or 3 at a time. Oh, she was very discreet about it, but you can't hide that sort of thing from the staff. I'm sorry, John, but at the time, I thought you were just too old for her liking. You're definitely kidding me on my children's life. Well, a couple of the other girls who worked at the club and myself told the police when they came around asking questions. But I don't think they believed us. Who was going to believe that an upright citizen like Mary Simmons was gangbanging teenagers? And of course, the boys weren't going to say anything to the police. They were trying to hang her murder on just about anyone they could think of at the time. The youngsters just kept their heads down. Anyway, it's time we got your little problem sorted out. How many times can you get it up, by the way? Jenny asked, removing the entire duvet from the bed. Oh, my God, that's a nice big one. Much bigger than my old man's. I hope I can handle it. All right, she replied. Jenny had no trouble getting the desired outcome. She gave me what may have been the best blowjob of my life. However, since I hadn't had a blowjob in such a long time, I suppose anything would have felt good. I had never seen Angela do a blowjob before, but that day, after she'd finished and swallowed everything, it was a first for me. Angela would only linger there long enough to prepare me for the main event, as she put it. Jenny then pulled me into the bathroom, where I found myself proudly standing in front of a jacuzzi that she had evidently filled while I was asleep. Jenny remarked, I've always wanted to play in one of these things, as we climbed inside. For the remainder of the morning, we played. To be honest, it was my first time ever shagging underwater. It was different, though I can't say I'd make the effort to repeat the experience if there was a good bed close by. As it happened, Jenny wasn't exactly ravenous. We spent most of the afternoon together after lunch, then Jenny decided it was time to return home to her devoted husband. Jesus, that was one dumb scum sucker she was married to, I replied. As previously mentioned, I felt that Jenny was too mature for me to be in a serious relationship with, but she was an incredible sex machine. She told me we could screw whenever I wanted during the day. I assured her that she wouldn't get anything in return, despite her claims to the contrary. I went out for a pint and a steak at the village pub that evening. Jenny wasn't lying when she told me they served reasonable ones there. I observed the bartender that Jenny had reported her husband to be robbing while I was there. I was even more convinced that he was a bloody fool. She had the village bike's appearance and voice. I never would have approached her. I woke up the following morning from an intriguing dream to find it was not a dream. Jenny was pulling off her old hoovering act. We followed the same routine from the day before after breakfast, but we did it in the shower rather than the jacuzzi. Jenny wasn't overly excited about the jacuzzi experience either, but we did spend some time in it and play around. Jenny was washing up at the sink after lunch when I noticed she was slapping her rear at me. "Not now, woman." "I've got some things to do today," I replied. She questioned, "Are you sure?" "Yeah, well, this is fun whilst it lasts, but you're soon going to find a beautiful woman of your own age to play with, and that's going to cut me off." "Oh, yeah, like who?" "The woman who's sitting up the road in her car for one. I'd say she's waiting for you to make an appearance." "What woman is this?" "Oh, I don't know, brunette, drives a little white car." "Helen Caffrey." "How did she know where to find me?" "I don't know, but she was snooping around the village last week before you got out." "Oh, was she?" "Well, let's finish this, and then I'll have a little word with Miss Caffrey." "Mrs. Caffrey, you mean?" "No, that can't be right. Her father's name was Caffrey, divorced, I should imagine, and she's returned to using her maiden name. Then she's definitely been married and has at least 2 kids. How do you work that one out?" "Wedding ring, or rather, the shadow of one on her finger, and the 2 child seats in the back of her car. She was in the village shop the other day when I was in there." "Quite the little detective, aren't you?" "Well, how do you think I caught my old man with that bloody barmaid? It opened my eyes and taught me to be a lot more observant, I can tell you. Anyway, stop talking and concentrate on what you're doing." "I'm nearly there." After our workout, I went to give Helen Caffrey a call on her cell phone, but Jenny advised me not to. While I cleaned up, she would go and surprise her. Jenny said it would catch her off guard. When I returned downstairs, Jenny was leading Helen into the lounge, so I went with them. Jenny left to get some tea ready. We sat down, and I said, "Are you still following me around?" "John, I'm sorry, but I knew where you were going to live when I saw you the other day. I was just being handy for when you got around to calling me. I told you I need you to tell me exactly what happened before you were arrested." "All right, if you insist. But I should imagine most of it was in the papers. Reporters take a slanted view on things." "John, you said that yourself the other day." Jenny returned to the room and set the tea on the coffee table. She settled into one of the other chairs. Helen regarded her quizzically before turning to face me. Jenny smiled broadly back at me as I looked at her. "Look on me as an independent observer and a chaperone. You never know, I might have some words of wisdom to throw in as well," Jenny replied. The part about the chaperone actually made sense. I mean, I was a murderer with a conviction. Helen was able to claim that anything had occurred. Who was a convicted murderer to trust? "Okay, Helen. As you no doubt know, I ran an employment agency in the town at the time. Angela, my wife, was a stay-at-home mom looking after our 2 little ones. I knew Bill and Mary Simmons as clients. Mary's company would sometimes ask me to find both temporary and full-time staff for them. Angela and I had been to dinner with the Simmons on a couple of occasions, and we'd returned the invitations, but I wouldn't have called either of them good friends. On the contrary, they weren't really my type, a little on the stuck-up side for my liking." "How did Angela get on with them?" Helen responded. "About the same as I did, I think. She did say a few times that she didn't like the way Bill Simmons looked at her. In the end, she told me she felt like he was undressing her with his eyes. Well, once Angela had told me that, I found reason to decline any further invitations from them. That was about it, and then one morning, I heard on the TV news that Mary had been found dead in a hotel bedroom somewhere. It surprised me because there was a hint of something dodgy going on with Mary. Honestly, I wouldn't have thought Mary was the type to, you know. Well, the hotel wasn't that far from her house. The Simmons weren't big customers of mine, so besides the normal curiosity that everybody had as to what had happened, I wasn't really interested. Angela and I discussed it a little, as everyone would do when someone they know had been murdered, and that was it, really. Then early in the morning a few days later, the police kicked my front door in and arrested me for murdering Mary. They had a search warrant for my house and office where they claimed that they found all kinds of stuff that connected me with Mary Simmons. You know, receipts for hotel rooms, book matches from the same hotel, and they even claimed that they found my fingerprints on a glass and a champagne bottle in the room that Mary was killed in. The next thing I know, some little who worked at the hotel swore blind that he delivered the bottle of champagne to Mary's room and that he had seen me in there with her. Oh, and the chit for that bottle of champagne, the police claimed that they found it in the suit jacket pocket I'd been wearing on the day she was murdered, and my car's registration number was on the car park attendance list. Only he could describe the car, he'd just written the number down. Well, that's about it. When we got into court, even I thought I sounded bloody guilty. Did you not have any kind of alibi? Nope, I worked on the monthly wages in the office by myself that evening. Naturally, the girls who worked for me claimed that I had finished them in the morning even though I was still working on them when they departed. However, that didn't demonstrate that I didn't sneak away, kill Mary, and then return to complete the task. How did those receipts and other items end up in your pocket? Helen inquired. Yes, they were planted by the ruthless police. I always get mad when I think about those receipts and the fingerprints on that champagne bottle. That's the only answer, I angrily replied. Somehow, I can't believe that the police planted that evidence, Helen replied. They had to have. Who else would be in a position or have the motivation to? Well, I guess I would have had the same thought if I were in your shoes. And you wouldn't have been the talk of the town with them if you had accused the police of planting it, Helen remarked. Or the magistrate. I pleaded guilty after realizing how skillfully they had fabricated my story, I continued. But there was someone else who could have planted the evidence, someone who would have known you were in the office on your own that night as well. Whom? This may not sit well with you, but have you ever given your wife, Angela, any thought? Helen suggested. Stop talking foolishness. Why would she want all that evidence to be planted? What makes her want to accuse me of killing someone? John, are your wife and kids still where they are now? Not at all. She's disappeared, from what I've heard. When she filed for divorce, I was pretty upset and she said a few things that I later regretted. She probably believes that I could hurt her. Ultimately, she did come to believe that I had killed Mary Simmons after having an affair with her. John, let's just take a quick look back. Why did you work on the wages so late that evening, please? Was that how you usually did things? No, I usually completed them during the day, but Angela was able to get us an interview at the town's top school. We requested that the kids be placed on their list, and before accepting the kids, they interview the parents. What would happen if I told you that the interview was scheduled months in advance? John, it never happened that Angela ran into the headmistress at the hair salon or anything. I promise that the interview was scheduled more than 2 months ago. She's retired now, but I spoke with the headmistress, Helen remarked as she picked up the briefcase she had brought in and took out a file, pulling out a piece of paper and passing it to me. It was a headmistress-signed statement regarding the school interview, validating what Helen had just said. Helen then hurled a picture onto the table, asking, "Who's that?" "May I ask?" she inquired. "Bill Simmons," I answered back. "And just who are these people?" Helen questioned, tossing more poor quality photos onto the table that were clearly stills from the store's security cameras. "I'd say they are Bill Simmons as well." Helen nodded. "Yes, I would agree. These are from stores close to the apartment where Angela and the kids were staying. In that instance, your eldest daughter is the one holding Bill Simmons's hand, and Angela is the woman who is just barely visible standing outside the store door." "No, it can't be." "John, I apologize, but it is. Bill Simmons was, I'm positive, a frequent guest in that apartment. The building doesn't have any security cameras, but when I showed the doorman Bill Simmons's picture, he instantly recognized it. The doorman added that he frequently spent the night. Helen waited for me to process everything while sitting back. But Helen, didn't you like Bill Simmons? You've told me this multiple times, I remarked. Jenny entered the discussion and said, John, I would assume that Angela told you that so you wouldn't invite the Simmons to dinner anymore. In this manner, when the four of you were together, she and Bill Simmons couldn't make a mistake and say something inappropriate. The most plausible explanation, said Helen. Are you attempting to inform me that my spouse set me up for homicide? Instead, I believe Bill Simmons was the driving force behind it. He was the one who benefited financially the most. He most likely also killed his wife. Angela merely arranged everything so that you couldn't simultaneously explain your whereabouts and the evidence. You were merely the victim, Helen clarified. How long have you known this, Helen? I asked, glancing at her. I yelled in protest. Jenny attempted to reassure me, saying, Now, don't go shooting the messenger, John. About a month, Helen answered. I've had my father's document since shortly after he passed away, but I didn't start to understand what could have actually happened until I started looking for Angela and found out that she had vanished with the kids. Some time ago, Bill Simmons disappeared out of thin air, and after Angela went missing. The next thing I knew, a young man who worked for the hotel was swearing blindly that he had brought Mary the bottle of champagne and that he had seen me in her room with her. And the receipt for that champagne bottle, the police said they discovered it in the pocket of my suit jacket that day she was killed. The car park attendant's list had my car's registration number on it, and only he knew how to describe it. He had just jotted down the number. That's all there is to it. Even I thought I sounded damned guilty when we got to court. Didn't you have an alibi or anything? Nope. I was in the office alone that night, doing the wages for the month. Of course, the girls on my staff said that I was still doing them as they left and that they were completed in the morning. But that didn't prove that I didn't slip out and murder Mary, then go back and finish the job. You've no idea how those receipts and things got into your pocket? Helen asked. Yeah, the bloody police planted them. That's the only answer, I replied angrily. I always get angry when I think about those receipts and the fingerprints on that bottle of champagne. Somehow, I can't believe that the police planted that evidence, Helen said. They must have. Who else would have the opportunity or the reason? Well, I suppose in your position, I would have thought the same thing. And I should imagine that once you accused the police of planting it, you wouldn't have been the flavor of the month with them, Helen commented. Or the judge. When I realized how well they'd stitched me up, I changed my plea to guilty, I added. But there was someone else who could have planted the evidence, someone who would have known you were in the office on your own that night as well. Who? You're not going to like this, but have you ever thought about your wife, Angela? Helen offered. Don't talk nonsense. Why would she want to plant all that evidence? Why would she want to frame me for murder? John, do you know where your wife and children are now? No. From what I've heard, she's gone into hiding. I was pretty upset when she divorced me and said a few things I regretted when I'd had the time to reflect on them. She probably thinks I'd do her some harm. Well, in the end, she did come to believe that I had an affair with Mary Simmons and murdered her. Let's just go back a little bit, John. Tell me, why were you doing the wages late that evening? Was that your normal habit? No, I normally did them during the day, but Angela had managed to swing an interview for us at the best school in town. We wanted the children to be on their list, and they interview the parents before they will accept the children. And if I told you that interview had been booked months in advance? Never Angela happened to run into the headmistress in the hairdressers or something, John. That interview was booked over 2 months previous, of that I can assure you. She's retired now, but I've spoken to the headmistress, Helen said, at the same time as she picked up the briefcase she brought in with her and removed a file from it. She sorted out a piece of paper from the file and handed it to me. It was a statement about the school interview, signed by the headmistress and confirming what Helen had just said. Then Helen threw a photograph on the table. "Who's that?" she asked. "Bill Simmons," I replied. "And who are these?" Helen asked, throwing several more pictures on the table, obviously stills from shop security cameras and not of very good quality. "I'd say they are Bill Simmons as well." "Yeah, I'd agree," Helen said. "These are from shops near to the flat where Angela and the children were living. I'd say in that one, the child who's holding Bill Simmons's hand is your eldest daughter, and the woman just visible standing outside the shop door is Angela." "No, it can't be." "I'm sorry, John, but it is. I'm damn sure that Bill Simmons was a regular visitor to that flat. There aren't any security cameras in the building, but the doorman recognized Bill Simmons's picture straight away when I showed it to him. And the doorman said that he often stayed overnight." Helen sat back and waited for me to take it all in. "But Helen, didn't you like Bill Simmons?" "You told me so on more than one occasion," I said. "John," Jenny joined the conversation, "I would think that Angela told you that so that you wouldn't invite the Simmons to dinner anymore. That way, she and Bill Simmons couldn't slip up and say the wrong thing when the four of you were together." "The most likely explanation," Helen offered. "Oh, are you trying to tell me that my wife framed me for murder?" "No, I'd say that Bill Simmons was the brains behind it. It was him who gained the most financially. He probably murdered his wife as well. Angela just placed all the evidence and made sure you couldn't account for your whereabouts at the same time. You were just the fall guy," Helen explained. I looked at Helen. "How long have you known this?" I demanded angrily. "Now, don't go shooting the messenger, John," Jenny said, trying to calm me down. "About a month," Helen replied. "I've had my father's papers since just after he died, but it was only when I started looking for Angela and discovered that she disappeared with the children that I began to realize what could have really happened. Bill Simmons had vanished into thin air some time back, and with Angela going missing, I just got to wondering. Anyway, I showed Simmons' picture around the flats where Angela had lived, and I wasn't really surprised that just about everybody had seen him around. I got up and paced the room. Angela, the woman I love, had cheated me and actually helped to frame me for Mary's murder. I had serious problems believing she'd do such a thing to me. Then I suddenly remembered our wedding anniversary and that bloody champagne Angela had brought for us to celebrate it with. I never have been one for champagne, too fizzy for my liking, but about 4 months before Mary's murder, Angela had a bottle of champagne that she'd asked me to open on our wedding anniversary. Damn it, they had to have been planning the fit-up for months. I'd never seen the connection between that anniversary champagne and the bottle the police found in Mary's hotel room before. Damn it, you're right. It all makes sense now, I told the girls, going on to tell them about the champagne. Damn it, the one person I trusted unconditionally turns out to be the person who put me away for 7 years. I shouted angrily. "Please sit down and calm yourself down, John," Helen said. "Now we've got to find out how to prove it and exactly who did murder Mary." "Well, Bill did, I should imagine," I said. "And what about his alibi?" "He had half a dozen people who told the police he was with them all that evening," Helen retorted. "Well, if not him, who? A hired killer? Where the hell would Bill Simmons find one of them? Look, there's only one person that we know who definitely did lie to the police, that waiter who said he saw you in Mary's hotel room. If you weren't there, then we know he lied to the police and in court. That's perjury. If we can find him and get him to tell the truth, well, then he must have seen who really killed Mary Simmons," Helen suggested. "That's if he ever went near the hotel room that night," I observed. "He must have to have given the killer the chit that they put in your pocket," she replied. "How will we find him anyway?" "I doubt he still works at the hotel," I asked. "No, he doesn't. He drives a hire car for a living nowadays. Strange, that. One hotel waiters don't earn much, but he bought a brand new Mercedes about 3 months after you were convicted," Helen said with a smile on her face. "Oh, and he paid for it in cash. You think that was his payoff money? Seems a lot for lying in court." Hey, maybe he killed Mary, I suggested, but immediately changed my mind. No, I remember the little bugger in court. He was a bloody weakling. How old was he? Jenny suddenly asked. Buggered if I know. 17, 18 maybe? He was only a kid, I replied. He was 20, but he looked a lot younger. He still looks like a teenager now, Helen informed us. Then maybe he was the bait that got Mary to the hotel room in the first place. He could have arranged all those hotel bookings as well if he was on the inside, Jenny suggested. What do you mean, just how Mary liked them? Helen asked, looking at Jenny. Jenny, after looking at me to get the go-ahead, told Helen about Mary's preference for younger men, or real boys. For a few moments, Helen thought, apparently digesting what Jenny had told her. No, I agree with Jenny, Helen said. He was and still is a bloody little weakling. Now, the guy who used to be the night manager, he was a very questionable character, and it was strange that if he was on reception as he was supposed to have been that night, he never claimed to have seen you enter or leave the hotel. It could be that he murdered Mary and wanted to stay right out of the public eye. This is all speculation, just as angry as you just did. But if he believed you, why didn't he do something? I demanded. Oh yeah, and who refused to see Inspector Harris in prison a few weeks back? Frank and Gary wanted to tell you what I've told you, but how did you put it? Tell the FBS to F***K off, that's what the warden said your reply was. And you wouldn't see me either. Whoops, yeah, I did say something similar, I admitted, maybe a bit more colorful. And I thought you were another damned reporter, so I ignored you the other day. Anyway, it was my idea that I'd try to approach you once you were released. Inspector Harris and Frank, his sergeant, have been looking into things and are trying to reopen the case. The trouble is, they don't think they have anything to get your conviction quashed unless they can find the real murderer. They want your cooperation, but they don't need you going off and knocking anyone around. Well, I couldn't do anything if I wanted to, yet. I'd have to track that little Curtis down first. Inspector Harris would like to talk to you before they talk to Curtis. Will you see them? Helen asked. Do I have a choice? I replied. No, not really. To be fair, you shouldn't have spent so much energy on calling Gary all those names. He was doing his job and he held no malice against you, Helen pointed out. I was beginning to think Helen was sweet on Inspector Gary Harris. A shame, she was a really nice-looking woman. But surely Harris was a little on the old side for her. Come on, Jenny was just a bit of fun for both of us. It wasn't going to be anything long-term, and we both knew it, I said. I'm not sure how it happened, but after Helen asked me if I'd meet with the police inspector, the subject of conversation changed completely to a discussion about the cottage, which culminated in Jenny giving both of us a tour of the house and garden. You know, I'd been there 2 days and hadn't even looked at the massive gardens. Leading down the left side of the garden was a long rose arbor-type tunnel covered in climbing roses. At the end of this tunnel was a little secret garden surrounded with box hedges, in the center of which stood a wooden table and chairs. Isn't it beautiful? Helen said. My girls would love this. There's a swing on the other side of that tree over by the pond, Jenny informed us. God, you're lucky to have found a place like this, John, Helen said as she ran over and sat on the swing. Well, don't just stand there, Jenny whispered to me, go be a gentleman and give her a push on the swing. Jenny, are you trying to play matchmaker? I asked as quietly as possible. Blimey, John, you've been staring at her like a cat who spotted a mouse in the undergrowth all afternoon. Go on, get your ass in gear, Jenny said, giving me a firm push in Helen's direction. How many children have you got? I casually asked Helen as I gently pushed her on the swing. 2 girls, 6 and 8, she replied. Who's looking after them? I asked, still trying to sound like I was making casual conversation. No, my mother-in-law is. My husband and I are divorced, but my in-laws are a great help to me and the children. I believe that's all I could think of to say was oh. My husband and my interests sort of separated. He took a little too much interest in his assistant, and he didn't take too kindly to my interest in boxing. That doesn't sound very alike. Oh, it wasn't. I knocked him out cold, and she ran naked from the hotel room. But I did enjoy the moment. Were there any unpleasant ramifications, with the police? No, he'd have looked a real coward standing in court and accusing his little woman of laying him out with one punch. I don't think the idiot ever took it seriously when I told him that my father had taught me to box and had insisted that I was proficient in judo before he let me get into this business. Some folks can turn very aggressive when their insurance claims are rejected. So, your father made sure you could defend yourself, I said, smiling down at her. Somehow, I couldn't picture Helen landing one on anybody who crossed her. When I need to, Helen said, turning in the swing so that I could see the smile on her face. Johnny, I think it's time I made a move, Jenny called out. My husband will be home from work before long. Good night. Hey, why don't you and Helen go out for a meal together, we both called out. Good night, we called out to Jenny as she walked back toward the cottage. I'm sorry about that. I think Jenny's a little on the pushy side, I said to Helen once Jenny was out of earshot. Well, I haven't eaten since breakfast, Helen said. But what about your children? I told you, my mother-in-law is at my house. She'll feed them and put them to bed. She does that quite often for me, I work some very weird hours in this job. A quick meal in the local pub before I go home will save me having to pick up a takeaway. Helen and I went to the local pub in her car, where I had another steak and she ate lasagna or something. After she left to go home to her family, I sat in a corner of the bar for the rest of the evening. Out of interest, I'm sure the little nymphomaniac behind the bar was trying to add me to the notches on her belt, but I ignored her unwelcome guests. Jenny didn't wake me in her usual fashion the following morning. I was suddenly aware of her shaking me. John, wake up, I heard her say through the fog in my brain. Wow, I don't need any of that this morning, I said to her when I noticed she had another glass of that concoction of hers in her hand. Who's here anyway? The police, I think. One of them is that inspector that Helen mentioned yesterday. At this time of day? What time is it anyway? I asked, still trying to clear the fog in my brain. 8:30, Jenny replied. In a bleeding hurry, aren't they? Okay, tell them I'll be down in a minute. Jenny, after giving me a nice smile, left the room, and I climbed out of bed. As I stood up, the sudden pain in my head told me that maybe I had hit the juice a little too hard the previous evening. I could just about remember staggering home. I made a mental note to cut down on alcohol. Then, having had second thoughts, I gulped down Jenny's weird concoction, making another mental note to get the recipe for it from her as well. The stuff tasted strange, but it definitely did the trick. Where are they? I asked Jenny when I came down the stairs. Outside, waiting, of course, John. Unless they have a warrant or just cause, the police can't enter a house unless the owner invites them in. This is your house, so I made them wait until you were ready to receive them. It never hurts to show them who's running things, I'm beginning to worry about you, Jenny. You haven't had some run-ins with the police, have you? I asked her, smiling. Let's just say my father wasn't the flavor of the month with them, shall we? I learned all about what the police can and can't do at a very young age. Jenny grinned back at me as she went to open the front door. The familiar face of Inspector Gary Harris entered the room, followed by an officer whom I vaguely recognized and assumed was the sergeant that Helen had mentioned. Mr. Carpenter, thank you for agreeing to see us, Harris said as he entered the lounge. Sit down, Inspector. I'm afraid I don't remember your oppo here's name, Frank Stevens, the other man said, offering his hand for me to shake. Sergeant Stevens. Now, I was a PC when we met last. Once I'd shaken the sergeant's hand, Gary Harris shoved his hand in my direction. For a moment, I detected the mason's grip, but when I didn't return it, it rapidly disappeared. So, Inspector, I thought to myself, a brother, are we? I wonder if you knew I was before I went down, or whether you're trying to tell me you are. John, the inspector began, but then corrected himself. Sorry, may I address you as John, Mr. Carpenter? You did the last time we met and never asked my permission, Gary, I replied sarcastically. I am sorry, John. The situation was very different then. Look, that was then, and this is now, Helen said. Miss Caffrey has informed me of the investigations that she and her late father have been making. What I believed all those years ago is not necessarily what I believe now. Miss Caffrey is convinced that Bill Simmons killed his wife and that your wife was instrumental in planting the evidence against you. I've come to believe that there is a possibility that she could be correct. A possibility, is that so? I said sarcastically. John, I don't put people behind bars because I like the idea. I have to act on the evidence that is before me at the time. Now, my trouble is that Helen has come up with certain information that leads me to believe that someone could have fooled me in the courts. I don't like to think that someone pulled the wool over my eyes, and if they did, I intend to see that they go to prison for a long time, Harris said with a very serious look on his face. So, you're not convinced I'm innocent, then? I asked. John, to be honest with you, what Miss Caffrey and her late father turned up has put your guilt in question. Forgetting the trial for the moment, if we may, in my mind, you are just a suspect in the murder of Mary Simmons. Can you understand what I'm saying? Oh, so if you can't pin it on Bill Simmons, you're quite happy that I've just spent 7 years in the slammer? I replied. John, I can only act on the evidence. But there is something much more important than your guilt or innocence at stake here, Harris said. Inspector Harris, what in the world do you think is more important to me than my conviction? I asked. What about the safety of your ex-wife and children? Harris asked. That statement by Harris really knocked the wind out of my sails. John Frank Stevens carried on. If what Helen believes did happen, and Bill Simmons did kill his wife, it stands to reason Angela must have helped him plant all that evidence implicating you. Now, suddenly, just before you come out, your wife and children have vanished into thin air. The inspector and I are concerned that Bill Simmons might get worried that you would put pressure on Angela to tell what she knows. John, what we've got to take into account is that if Simmons did kill his wife for her money, what's to stop him from killing again to keep the secret? I looked from one officer to the other as what Sergeant Stevens had just said to me sunk into my brain. This was a completely different ball game and something I hadn't in my wildest dreams contemplated. A sudden feeling of panic began to rise within me. Well, what the hell are you doing to find them? I demanded. Everything we can, John. I can assure you checks have been made at all airports and ports. We're pretty sure they haven't left the country, Gary Harris said in an attempt, I think, to reassure me. What use is that? He's hardly likely to take them abroad before he kills them, is he? I replied, my anger still rising. Calm down, please, John. We don't know that he is going to harm them. It's just something we have to take into account. We, or rather Helen, believes they are in hiding in the country somewhere. We'll track them down in the end, you can be sure of that, Harris said. Yon H, Miss Caffrey thinks they can't be too far away. Bill Simmons must have been living somewhere fairly close by when he was visiting Angela at the flat. We very much suspect that Angela and the children are staying at his place, Frank Stevens added. I had noted that, whilst trying to sound formal where Helen was concerned, both officers would refer to her by her Christian name when they let their guard down. There had been some undertone in Helen's voice that I'd picked up when she had mentioned Frank Stevens the previous evening. It wasn't a conscious thought at the time, but I was beginning to wonder whether there was something going on between them. Frank Stevens was a handsome guy and more Helen's age than Harris was. I can't see how you guys expect me to help. You know everything I know from those interviews we had years ago, and I've been in the slammer ever since, I said. Well, John, Harris said with an unusual tone to his voice, actually, our hands are pretty well tied. But what Frank and I were thinking was that if we could put some pressure on Curtis, you never know, he might get scared enough to do some talking. And how do you intend to do that? I asked. As police officers, we can't really, but we could hint to Curtis that you have been going on about him lying in court and appear to be after him, Frank Stevens suggested. Well, shouldn't I be pissed with him? Generally, convicted felons don't go after the witnesses who gave evidence against them. If they told the truth in court, they might be fairly pissed off with them, but they don't generally go looking for them, I said. The idea is we let Curtis know you're after his blood, and then you make a couple of appearances, Frank said. And that's supposed to scare him into telling you the truth? I asked. Well, not exactly, John, Harris said. What we expect Curtis to do is try to kill you. Do what? Where the hell would that little coward get the guts to kill me? I asked. We're pretty sure he's killed before, Harris announced. Who? That little wimp couldn't have stabbed Mary Stevens. No, that's not his style. Curtis likes to use cars. We're damn sure it was him who ran down Helen's father, Frank said. And do you know that Sheila Thomas was also killed in a hit-and-run accident, a stolen Ford again, the same as Helen's father? As a teenager, Curtis had a habit of taking Fords. It appears he finds them easy to nick, Harris said. Holy Sheila is dead, but that makes some sense. She was supposed to have been with Angela the night of Mary's murder. What do you think? Sheila looked after the children whilst Angela went to the hotel to get that bleeding chit for the champagne that you found in my pocket, something along those lines. I asked. Look, John, we didn't just assume anything. Sheila Thomas assured us that Angela didn't leave the house until you got there. That's right, she was leaving when I arrived home that night, I said. Well, it's more than a slight possibility that Sheila died because she knew that Angela had left the house, Harris added. And you think that Curtis drove the car that killed her? I asked. It's a possibility, or more likely, we think he could have stolen the car and someone else drove it. Bill Simmons, for instance, Harris said. Look, John, modern cars aren't all that easy to steal, although actually, they aren't too difficult either if you know what you're doing. The odds on Bill Simmons knowing how to break into a car and being able to drive the thing away are pretty long. But to Curtis, a Ford is a piece of cake. The plan is we put the wind up on Curtis, then you show up and make sure he sees you. We thought it would be best if you booked into a hotel near where he lives. We can clear that with your probation officer. There's no point in leading Curtis back here if it doesn't work. Then we sit on you and Curtis and wait to see what the bugger does. This all sounds a little dangerous to me. Jenny's voice came from the doorway. I'd almost forgotten she was still in the house. Jenny entered the room carrying a tray of teas. When she had put the tray on the table, she sat herself in one of the spare chairs. I'm not sure I like what you are planning, Jenny began. John, I understand that you're pissed off with Curtis, but are you sure it's a good idea to put yourself in the firing line like that? Jenny asked. To be honest, Jen, I'm not too keen on the idea myself, but the only other option is for me to kick the crap out of the little prat, and I can't see Gary or Frank here letting me get away with that in a hurry, I replied. Now, that would put you back inside, Gary said. But, Jenny, I don't think John's going to be in any real danger. He knows what the score is, and will be expecting trouble. Look, John, if Curtis doesn't take the bait quite quickly, we'll have to think of something else. Anyway, we only have enough manpower to watch him around the clock for a few days. Well, if you're going to do something silly like this, I want to help, Jenny announced. You can book me into that damned hotel as well, and I'll watch John's back. I can smell a policeman half a mile away. What's to say Curtis can't do the same? All three of us looked at Jenny, and from her facial expression, we knew what was going to happen. There's some women who, when they've made their mind up, nothing is going to dissuade them from their choice of action.